law mandating fixed ancestral surnames for the entire Swedish population. Why? Well, one thing to remember is the rapid development.
Olá pessoal, sejam bem-vindos a mais um vídeo desse canal. Nós somos cidadãos do terceiro mundo e nesse canal nós reagimos e aprendemos sobre o primeiro mundo. Nesse vídeo nós vamos reagir a quando o governo faz você aceitar o seu nome.
Então aproveite a oportunidade e considere se inscrever em nosso canal, clique no gostei, compartilhe esse vídeo e visite o nosso Instagram para fazer mais sugestões de conteúdos como esse. E agora, vamos para a reação.
In Sweden, back in the olden days, also known as the 1600s, your average Sven didn't really have a surname. There were some inherited family names placed after given names as we know them today, but they were borne by a relatively small section of the population. The nobility, especially the urader, or original nobility, often had adelsnamn, noble names, according to their noble house. Some of these date back as far as the 1300s, and many were based on the family crest. In the early to mid-17th century, the entire nobility adopted surnames to distinguish them from the filthy commoners, reflecting their status as the highest caste in Swedish society. Meanwhile, a lot of the clergy had lärdanamn, literally learned names, which had been in use since the Renaissance, and were thus inspired by the classics. They often ended in ander from Greek or us from Latin. In the latter case, the surnames would often have to agree with the natural gender of its holder. Us was after all a masculine ending, so the feminine a was preferred for women. A lot of the Latin-sounding names later dropped the us, leading to names ending in in or el. It's possible that this was done because of fashionability. People didn't want to be Lundinus anymore. They wanted to be Lundin, so it looked like their name came from French, which was much more fancy.
Eu acho muito curioso como a influência do latim foi muito forte em muitos países e chama muito a minha atenção que eles quiseram soar parecido com o francês.
É verdade.
Than Latin in the 1700s. But that's just a theory. Then there were the townspeople. Those who were more well off, like merchants, would often take surnames in imitation of the noblemen, possibly in order to imitate their status. These are known as borgerliga namn, bourgeois names. These were inspired by the noble names and learned names, but also by German family names, and importantly, place names. That's not to say that normal people all just had one name. As was common all over Scandinavia and beyond at the time, people tended to be referred to by their given name and a patronymic. A patronymic is a name formed from the name of your father, thus denoting whose child you are. For instance, if you take your average heterosexual Swedes, Lars and Karin, and they had a boy, Nils, he would be named Nils Larsson, contracted from Nils, Lars's son. And if they had a girl, let's say Sigrid, she would be named Sigrid Larsdotter, from Sigrid, Lars's daughter. What makes this different from those gendered surnames from earlier is that the next generation, say Nils's children, wouldn't carry this on as a family name. No, they would be called so-and-so Nilsson, or so-and-so Nilsdotter. Another type of byname, associated especially with the Dalarna region of Sweden, was gårdsnamn. These weren't placed after the given name, but before it, like in Chinese or Korean, and they were closer to family names than patronymics, in that they were usually inherited from generation to generation. Some of these were fossilized patronymics, with someone called Pash Yuan not necessarily being the son of Pad, but having a male ancestor somewhere called Pad. Sometimes a man's ancestral name would actually be replaced with his wife's, like Ingrid's Yuan, being a Yuan who had gotten married to Ingrid. Other gårdsnamn were simply a person's profession, like Smed Johan being John the Smith, something we can also see as an origin for many English surnames. There were also those called after the village they or their ancestors were born in, typically when that family had moved village. So in the village of Norse, there might be a family called Utby, because of their origins in the neighbouring village. Though most famous are the bynames that were taken from farms. For instance, if there was a farm called Östgården, the family living there might be called Öst. Sometimes it's difficult to tell the difference between one of these and a fossilized patronymic, since a farm might be called Persgård, and then the family on that farm might be called Pers, even if they themselves had in fact bought the farm and were not descended from Pad. But where this gets really interesting is that a lot of the time these bynames weren't just inherited by blood. Buying a farm can change your byname. Of course, apprentices could inherit the professional names of their masters. Families living on the same farm could all have the same byname without being blood relatives.
Eu confesso que pra mim isso é muito, muito doido, porque é muito diferente do que a gente tem aqui, né? Tipo, aqui não funciona nem um pouco parecido com o que é na Suécia. Mas é muito curioso, porque ao mesmo tempo é uma coisa diferente, mas eu acho muito, muito peculiar e muito único também essa questão deles adotarem isso no final do nome, né? Tipo, filho, né, de alguém. Realmente é muito doido e muito legal.
E é um pouco confuso, porque segundo a informação que a gente vê no vídeo, até nome de fazenda poderia fazer parte do nome de alguém. E isso realmente é insano.
In Iceland, they still use patronymics, or, in the modern age, matronymics, but Swedish names are now pretty much all ancestral surnames. So how did these old naming systems disappear? In 1901, the Swedish government passed a law mandating fixed ancestral surnames for the entire Swedish population. Why? Well, one thing to remember is the rapid development of the state at this point in Scandinavian history. State records were becoming increasingly important, replacing traditional church records which would only record information within a certain parish. So having one standardized type of byname throughout the whole country is easier for centralized documentation. Sweden wanted to quote-unquote modernize. The Danes were doing it after all. In fact, Denmark had passed its first law making ancestral surnames compulsory all over the country in 1828. The many failures of this policy make up a whole story of their own, but it is likely that it had an effect on the Swedish authorities. The Swedish policy was far more successful, likely because many Swedes had already adopted surnames independently during the 19th century in a kind of natural transition. Many of the surnames that were assumed in the 1800s, and then after the law was passed in the early 1900s, were fossilized patronymics, though the dotter ending pretty quickly died out because, of course it did. And that's why there's so many Swedes with son names, and it's the same reason why so many Danes have sen names, and there's so many son names in English-speaking communities. In fact, there were too many son names. This wasn't as much of a problem as sen names were in Denmark at the time, but it was still difficult to keep track of everyone in this rapidly changing world when there were so few names. Nearly 3% of those listed in the 1901 Swedish telephone registry had the surname Andersson. So then came a period in the first half of the 20th century where Swedes changed their surnames like crazy. Part of this was probably because of their own experiences in an increasingly urbanized Sweden. Being confused for the other Lars Andersson in Stockholm for the third time this week would probably make anyone consider changing that annoying frozen patronymic to something more unique. And of course, from the government's perspective, the point of making everyone get surnames in the first place was for easier documentation, so unique surnames were all the better for them. They encouraged this practice by making changing your name much easier, and even publishing official state books of surname suggestions. The first of these being the 1921 Svensk namnbok till vägledning vid val av nya släktnamn, Swedish Namebook, for guidance at choosing of new family names. So loads of purely made-up surnames turned up in the 1900s in Sweden. Several branches of my own family changed their names in this period. One part of my ancestry changed their names from Pettersson to Vernulf. This name is, linguistically speaking, ridiculous. This W was not used at the time in Swedish orthography, making the name look German in origin, but German doesn't use this letter. Like Swedish, it uses this symbol instead, making this look more like it might be an antiquated Danish name. But what on earth does Van mean? Is this supposed to be from Dutch? Middle English? The answer is it doesn't have a meaning. My great-granddad and his brothers made it up. It's a fairy tale name, and there's loads of people in Sweden walking around with this kind of gibberish surname, and you know what? I think that's cool. Of course, the policy was never going to be a complete success. I mean, the government needed, or rather wanted, a standardized way of recording names, and it's not exactly a coincidence that they chose the way already used by the nobility and the rich. In the community.
Uau, isso é incrível. O governo, ele precisava de alguma forma poder registrar esses cidadãos e a forma como eles encontraram era padronizar os nomes. Mas é muito curioso que em determinado momento as pessoas simplesmente começaram a criar outros nomes que não eram muito comum de ser usados lá. Uau, isso é muito, deve ter dado muito trabalho para fazer isso.
É verdade, você vê que eles estavam procurando uma coisa mais prática, né? Mas eu acho muito curioso isso, assim, na minha cabeça, assim, é interessante porque eu me pergunto como que eles veem, né, tipo, essa questão de ser algo dado, assim, pelo governo, né, para escolher, porque eu não sei, se fosse aqui no Brasil, acho que muitas pessoas não iam aceitar de forma alguma isso, iam falar que o Estado está controlando. Realmente, eu não sei como seria, mas é muito diferente, né, é outra realidade, então é uma coisa que funciona diferente quando a gente tenta entender.
That were unused to after names, which were almost entirely rural and generally quite poor, like in Dalarna, where gårdsnamn were the main style of surname, the 1901 law was met with resistance. In fact, some of them continued to fight it for over a century, and laws protecting the use of gårdsnamn were finally enacted in 2016. Wow, isn't it interesting how much local culture and tradition is lost with the creation of the modern state and how the cultural practices of the rich and privileged are prioritized over those of other communities? I mean, nah, what am I saying? Let's not get political here.
Incrível. Realmente, agora dá pra entender melhor porque que eles têm o nome assim. Porque a gente já tinha visto em outro vídeo falando a respeito dessa questão dos nomes, se eu não tô enganada, mas eu não tinha entendido muito bem. Mas realmente é muito louco, porque... Tipo, ao mesmo tempo, você vê que até mostra no vídeo, né? A pessoa falando lá, outro eu, né? Tipo, várias pessoas com o mesmo sobrenome, mas realmente, assim, é muito doido, porque é outra realidade. É difícil até imaginar isso aqui, né?
É verdade. E é muito curioso a gente perceber como surgiram os nomes na Suécia e como em determinado momento houve mudança em relação à influência de um outro tipo de idioma. E eu acredito que isso deva ter sido um processo bem confuso, e implementar isso também, houve a necessidade de ter que escolher alguns nomes para poder ter um controle maior. E realmente é interessante que, historicamente, como o latim influenciou tão forte tantos idiomas e países, não sendo apenas o idioma sueco, mas de vários outros países. Isso faz com que a gente reflita quão grande foi a própria expansão, né, desse idioma através de impérios e coisas do tipo. Mas é impressionante ver toda essa trajetória e história em relação à Suécia. Realmente é uma outra cultura, é um outro jeito de elaborar as coisas. E isso faz com que a Suécia seja tão fascinante, que a gente fique com muita vontade de poder visitar e conhecer esse país também. Bom, mas essa foi a reação desse vídeo. Portanto, aproveite a oportunidade, considere se inscrever no nosso canal, clique no gostei, compartilhe esse vídeo e visite o nosso Instagram para fazer mais sugestões de conteúdos como esse.
Muito obrigada por assistir esse vídeo e nos vemos na próxima reação. Tchau!